You could not build a smartphone. Not from scratch. Not even close. You don't know how to mine silicon, refine it, etch a microchip, or write the code that makes the screen respond to your finger. Neither could the person who handed you your morning coffee. Neither could the engineer who designed your car. And yet here you all are, surrounded by machines none of you understand, none of you could recreate alone. That should terrify you a little. It doesn't, because you've never had to think about it. But it's the key to everything that makes humans different from every other animal on Earth. Here's the strange part. You are not smarter than a chimpanzee in the way you think you are. Put a human toddler and a young chimp through the same cognitive tests, spatial reasoning, basic math, memory, and they perform almost identically. Sometimes the chimp wins. The gap isn't in raw brain power. The gap is somewhere else entirely. So, what is it? For decades, anthropologists assumed it was intelligence alone. Bigger brain, more neurons, smarter species, simple story. Except, the story falls apart the moment you look closely. Individually, humans are not nearly clever enough to invent the things we depend on. No single person ever invented the bow and arrow. No single person ever invented agriculture or the kayak or the controlled use of fire. These weren't bursts of genius. They were slow accumulations built by thousands of minds across hundreds of generations, each person adding one small improvement to what came before. This is the forgotten skill. Not intelligence, not tool use, not even language exactly. It's something quieter and far more powerful. The ability to copy each other with extreme accuracy and to keep what works long enough to improve it. Researchers call this cumulative culture, and the anthropologist Joseph Henrich has spent much of his career trying to prove that it, not individual smarts, is the real engine behind human dominance. In his research, Henrich points to a chilling case study from the history of European exploration. In the 1800s, British naval expeditions sent some of the most intelligent, best-equipped men of their era into the Arctic. Trained officers, advanced technology for the time, detailed planning. They died, almost all of them. Meanwhile, Inuit communities had lived in that same brutal landscape for thousands of years, not because any single Inuit person was a genius inventor, but because their survival knowledge had been refined and passed down, generation after generation, until it worked perfectly. How to build a shelter that traps heat, which seal fat insulates best, how to read ice that looks safe but isn't. No one alive had invented all of it. They had simply inherited it, intact, from people who came before. That's the trick. That's the whole trick. Your ancestors weren't smarter than you. They were better at copying. Here's where it gets even stranger. The psychologist Michael Tomasilo ran a now famous comparison between human children and great apes, testing how well each species could learn from others through imitation. Chimpanzees can imitate, but loosely. They watch a demonstration, then often skip steps that seem unnecessary, focusing only on the end goal. Human children do something different. Even very young children copy actions with almost obsessive precision, including steps that serve no obvious purpose. Researchers call this over-imitation. Why would copying something pointless be useful? Because you don't always know which steps matter. If your ancestor watched an elder prepare a poisonous plant for food, removing toxins through a long, tedious, multi-step process, skipping the unnecessary steps could kill you. Over-imitation isn't a flaw. It's an evolutionary safety net. Copy everything exactly, even the parts that seem useless, because you might not understand why they matter until it's too late to find out the hard way. This single trait, high-fidelity social learning, let knowledge survive long enough to be improved instead of being lost and reinvented every generation. And once knowledge starts compounding instead of resetting, something extraordinary happens. Innovation stops depending on individual genius and starts depending on population size and connection. The anthropologist Kim Hill studied something that proves this directly. Working with indigenous communities, including the Ache in Paraguay, Hill mapped how skills and tools spread, not just within a single group, but across separate, unrelated bands through occasional contact, marriage, and shared gatherings. Groups that stayed more socially connected to other groups maintained more complex toolkits. Groups that became isolated, even briefly, sometimes lost skills entirely within a generation or two. This is where the story bends back toward you. Anthropologist Polly Vassner studied the skunk people of the Kalahari and found something almost poetic. During the day, conversations around the campfire were dominated by gossip, complaints, economic matters, practical talk. But at night, around the fire, the subject shifted almost entirely to storytelling. Myths, histories, cautionary tales about other groups, other places, other ways of surviving. Vissner proposed that firelight itself may have extended the day long enough for humans to develop something animals rarely do. Extended, emotionally rich information sharing, untethered from the urgent tasks of daylight. In other words, the campfire wasn't just for warmth. It was humanity's first information network. Think about what that means. The skill that took over the planet wasn't muscle or speed or claws or venom. It was sitting in a circle telling a story precisely enough that someone else could retell it, decades later, word for word, to someone who hadn't been born yet when the story first happened. You still do this. You just don't call it survival anymore. Every time you watch a tutorial and copy it exactly, even the parts that seem unnecessary, you're running the same ancient software that let your ancestors out survive every other species on Earth. Every time you explain something to a coworker, a child, a friend in enough detail that they could do it themselves, you're adding one more link to a chain that stretches back further than written history. Every meme, every recipe passed down from a parent, every piece of advice repeated almost word for word from someone who heard it from someone else. That's cumulative culture, still running, still compounding, right now, in your pocket, in your conversations, in the device you're hearing this on. You didn't invent the smartphone. Nobody did, not really. Thousands of minds did, layered on top of each other, none of them starting from zero, each one trusting the last enough to copy it precisely and improve just one small piece. That's not a weakness. That was never a weakness. That was always the plan.